Atlantis, a prime example of a lost city. The mystical locality has traditionally divided people into two camps: those who place the stories of the lost island empire in the world of myth and legend, and those who believe that the remains of Atlantis are really slumbering out there somewhere. But that's not all. Supposedly, it has finally been possible to rediscover the lost ruins, not at the bottom of the sea, but in the middle of the desert. You want to know what this almost unbelievable theory is all about? Then give us a thumbs up and a subscription, and be sure to watch our video to the end. Before we get started, we need your opinion. Do you think Atlantis really existed? Or did Plato play a joke on us all? Let us know your thoughts on this in the comments below. And now, let's get started. Der Atlantis Mythos. Before we go into more detail about where and how the remains of Atlantis were located and identified, let's first get a brief overview of what Atlantis actually is. As briefly mentioned at the beginning, the stories about the legendary island kingdom go back to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, mentioned in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC. Atlantis was no less than one of the most prosperous and powerful empires the world has ever seen. In detail, it was larger than Libya and Asia together, with the magnificent island of Atlas forming the heart of Atlantis. Here, the residents could enjoy lush gold and silver deposits, and the coveted substance, Oriharukon, was also found here in abundance. Furthermore, the natural faces of countless trees, plants, and exotic animals, such as elephants, were found here as well. From an architectural and infrastructural point of view, Atlantis was a genuine masterpiece. The sophisticated canal systems supplied the fertile land with the water it needed at all times of the year. The center of the main island formed a 400 to 600 kilometer wide plain, which was lined and crisscrossed by right-angled canals, dividing the area into many small inland islands. Around the Acropolis, i.e. the fortifications located on a mountain, there were three ring-shaped water belts that flowed into the sea via a canal. The Temple of Poseidon was again completely covered with gold, silver, and Oriharukon. No less impressive were the solid gold statues surrounding the site. With regard to its inhabitants, the interpretation of Atlantis followed a strict hierarchy. While the rulers resided in the innermost district, the guards, warriors, and the citizens followed from the inside out. Lust for power and downfall. The first ruler of Atlantis was Atlas, a mortal son of the sea god Poseidon. Over time, the king and his descendants succeeded in turning the originally rural island into a feared sea power that was second to none. Ultimately, the Atlantis army is said to have comprised 1,200 warships and 250,000 soldiers who conquered large parts of Europe and North Africa and were only stopped by the Athenians. Eventually, the outnumbered Athenians managed to bring the warriors of the mighty island empire to their knees. If one believes the legend, however, it was not the warfare of the Athenians, but the wrath of the gods that sealed the defeat of Atlantis, and finally, the final downfall of the sea power. Thus, the kings of Atlantis had drawn the displeasure of the deities upon themselves, since they were obsessed with greed, power, and wealth, and considered themselves invincible. But also, the increasing mixing of the once divine ruling family with normal mortals ultimately led to the fate of Atlantis being decided before a divine court. In order to punish the overconfident rulers and inhabitants of the empire for their pride, the gods conjured up a severe natural catastrophe, as a result of which Atlantis collapsed around the year 9600 BC and was swallowed up by the sea. Myth and reality. A controversial debate has been circulating for many centuries as to how Plato's explanations of Atlantis are to be correctly interpreted. One side is firmly convinced that the sea power described in the dialogues never really existed. Accordingly, the philosopher simply used the mystical island kingdom as a metaphor to warn the Athenians not to perish, like Atlantis, from their own addiction to expansion. Criticism of this interpretation is based, among other things, on the fact that Plato always clearly identified the stories he invented as fictional works. In addition, such a detailed and precise description of the island kingdom as provided by Plato was simply unnecessary if Atlantis had only been an imaginary symbol. In addition, some passages of the Atlantis story also appear in other dialogues of Plato, which are commonly understood as clearly historical. In fact, many people who believe in the existence of Atlantis consider it probable that Plato only heard about the reports about the island kingdom on a trip to Egypt, and consequently the legend cannot have been invented at all. But this story is also vulnerable. To this day, it is not even certain whether Plato really was in Egypt. If he did visit the kingdom of the pharaohs, he would have needed the help of a translator. But even in this case, it is unclear how the philosopher later adapted and possibly expanded the Atlantis account. The contentious question of whether Atlantis really once existed is fueled above all by the fact that there has always been no trace of the sunken ruins of the empire, although countless localization attempts have already been made in the past, which assumed Atlantis to be in the most diverse places in the world. No one has been granted the privilege of discovering the remains of the once flourishing sea power. However, if you follow an equally exciting and controversial thesis, the answer to the question of where Atlantis hides has been right under our noses for thousands of years. The search for Atlantis. Against this background, countless people have already made it their task to track down the remains of the lost kingdom and bring them back to reality. However, a clear breakthrough is still a long way off. According to the countless localization hypotheses, the ruins of Atlantis could lie dormant practically anywhere on our globe, no matter whether on Helgoland, Crete, or the Canary Islands. The theories that exist in this regard are as varied as they are unconfirmed. However, some ancient maps could now help us solve the mystery of Atlantis once and for all. But what is a once mighty island empire doing in the middle of the desert? The Eye of the Sahara. Yes, you heard me right. Those who believe in the authenticity of the maps mentioned, which we will discuss in more detail later, suspect that the ruins of Atlantis have lain dormant in Mauritania for millennia. This theory is not new by any means. However, in the recent past, a YouTuber with a channel named Bright Insight proposed a theory that the Eye of the Sahara may have actually been the location of the long-lost city of Atlantis. According to this theory, the Eye of the Sahara fits all of the descriptions that were provided by Plato when he encountered the city thousands of years ago. According to legend, the city eventually flooded and became consumed by water. If this is true, there are likely countless ancient artifacts buried in the sandy terrain. Bright Insight suggests that it's worth exploring and excavating the area to try to better understand what this bizarre structure is. His theory claims that many of the large formations that can still be seen on satellite images of the area show that large deposits of salt exist in the sand. He claims that these salt formations would have built up over the course of hundreds of years due to salt water previously running through the area. He feels so confident that his theory is correct that he even offered a reward of $10,000 to anyone who is able to travel to the area and search for fish bones or other artifacts. His theory also details the writings of Plato and how several large gullies seem to line up perfectly with where Plato described rivers and other bodies of water flowing in and out of the city. Plato also claimed that there would have been bodies of both saltwater and freshwater in the area, which seems to have been true as well. This theory has been debated by many mainstream historical researchers, such as Graham Hancock. However, no one has been able to disprove this theory completely. In all likelihood, the Eye of the Sahara may very well have been the resting place of thousands of people who perished in the flood that claimed the lost city of Atlantis, if such a city truly did exist all those years ago. Located in the west of the Sahara, what is officially known as Richat structure is in fact unequivocal proof that Plato's stories had a kernel of truth. But first, let's see what the official site has to say about the background of the so-called Eye of the Sahara. By definition, we're dealing with a ring-shaped crater-like geomorphological structure. So far so good. There has always been disagreement as to what led to the formation of this unique formation. What is certain is that the striking ring walls run concentrically, and have a diameter of an incredible 45 kilometers. This makes the Richat structure so powerful that it can even be seen from space, which has actually been used as a landmark on some missions. At first, the experts assumed that the Eye of the Sahara was created in the course of a meteorite impact. While this theory is now largely rejected due to the lack of impact rocks, more recent approaches focus on volcanic explosions and the consequences of erosion. However, the background to the development of Richat structure has not yet been clearly deciphered, which is why there is still plenty of room for speculation. A new old lead? As already mentioned, Plato wrote that the Acropolis of Atlantis was surrounded by 3 annular belts of water. Given the striking structure of the Eye of the Sahara, some people believe it is possible that this is actually the site that the philosopher described thousands of years ago, and it would actually have been easy for us to find out some time ago, if only we had carefully examined Herodotus' histories and the illustrations based on them. As the only surviving work by the Greek writer, the 9-book collection was made in the 5th century BC. Here, Herodotus gives us a comprehensive insight into those significant events that took place between the years 700 and 479 BC. Based on the explanations of the ancient historian, several maps were created over time, which graphically show us the so-called world of Herodotus. Now, if we look more closely at the illustrations and look at the area that is southwest of the Italian boot, we see an inconspicuous but significant entry there, Atlantis. Controversial theory. So, do Herodotus' maps of the world provide evidence or even proof that the Eye of the Sahara is really the ruins of Atlantis? Did the Greek writer possibly have hidden knowledge and even visit the remains of the mighty empire himself? Well, we can't make it that easy for ourselves at this point. First and foremost, we should remember that Herodotus never made a map of the world himself. The depictions were only created afterwards on the basis of his historical explanations. The temporal context must also not be disregarded under any circumstances. Plato only published his Atlantis story some time after Herodotus' death. In addition, we have the problem here that the basic structure of the Eye of the Sahara is reminiscent of the structure of Atlantis described by Plato. Apart from that, however, no further correspondences have been found. While Atlantis was once adorned with valuable sources of raw materials and magnificent buildings, there is no trace of such finds in the west of the Sahara. The future will show whether all these artifacts were simply swallowed up by the hot desert sand over time, or whether the search for Atlantis should be continued elsewhere. But keep in mind, when we think of the Sahara today, we immediately think of images of seemingly endless sandy landscapes, characterized by the scorching heat. A look at the equally countless and majestic desert dunes lead us to suspect that the Sahara has always been as dry and deserted as it is today. However, if we turn back the wheel of time by just 6,000 years, we would find a blooming green savanna paradise instead of a dry wasteland. In the somewhat recent past, the Sahara served as a home for countless settlers whose grazing animals could help themselves to the lush vegetation of the regions as they pleased. Countless lakes, regular rainfall, and even a gigantic river were part of the normal landscape of the Sahara at that time. The corresponding watering hole, known as the Tamanrasset, was a torrent at the time that, together with its numerous tributaries, meandered more than 500 kilometers across the African continent. If the riverbed, which has since dried up, was still carrying water today, it would easily be entered on the list of one of the longest bodies of water on the planet. As a result, many early settlers also settled on the banks of the Tamanrasset. The drying up of the once mighty river is said to have triggered a gigantic migration of peoples. Megachad, a prehistoric lake in Central Africa, was once one of the most important water resources on the continent. During its heyday, the lake stretched over an incredible 1.95 million square kilometers, making it around 5 times larger than the Caspian Sea. No modern lake could have rivaled these gigantic dimensions. The drastic change in the landscape of the Sahara took only the blink of an eye in the context of the entire history of the Earth. So could the Sahara Desert truly hold the key to the mystery of the lost city of Atlantis? How do you think the Atlantis myth should be understood? And if the legendary empire really existed, are its remains really in the Sahara? As always, let us know your thoughts, suggestions, and feedback on today's video in the comments below. And if you're already there, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe to stay up to date from now on. And with that, thanks for watching, have a good one, and see you next time.